Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. International collaboration and the future of surgical research is a fairly large topic. Let's see how this works. And I have to admit that I'm no expert in crystal balling. I've been told tongue-in-cheek that foretelling is difficult, particularly when it involves the future. But as we approach the future, it might as well be the next exit. So I will give a helicopter overview over aspects of international collaboration in surgery, some of the backgrounds and barriers, success stories, some of the strategies involved, the development of collaboration from a surgeon perspective, networks development and capacity building, and some perspectives of how surgical research may develop further in the future. The global view, or the global status of surgery, is that 11% of the global burden of disease are contributed by surgical conditions, and surgery are called a neglected stepchild of global public health. Globally, about 240 million operations are performed annually. Many of those, or most of those, are performed in non-elective cases. In the UK, there is a 98% lifetime risk of having surgery. In the US, the average American receives 7 operations during his or her lifetime. Patients recruited to trials, however, are very low. In one California study, they demonstrated that less than 1% of all cancer patients treated for solid tumors were enrolled in some kind of study or trial. So there's a clear discrepancy between the number of patients available and the number of patients recruited to trials. And there's a discrepancy between the answers that we need in surgery and the questions that are being asked. If you look at the global population, which is steadily increasing, and in the view of the world mapper, where you see each country, the size of each country contributed by the relative number of inhabitants in each region, you see a large number of the populations live in developing areas of the world. Whereas if you look at the number of physicians distributed in the same map, you see that those areas of the world that are underdeveloped have the lowest numbers of physicians. And the average number of physicians per 100,000 is about 150 all over the world. And as you can see, there is a huge discrepancy between the developed countries and the developing countries. Further so for surgery, because surgeons are outnumbered by physicians by 1 to 5, in some countries by 1 to 10. So surgical provision is not equally distributed around the world. If you look at the UN regions around the world, there is a knowledge about collaboration going on. Most evident is the collaboration between the East and West, particularly between North Americas and Europe. There are collaborations within regions such as Europe, but even also in South America and Africa, but very little collaboration, as we know, between the southern parts of the world. So there is a need for capacity building. The regions that have the lowest number of collaboration, the lowest number of research, are also the areas with the lowest capacity for surgery. And capacity needs to be increased. Here is one way of increasing capacity, probably a solution that is not sustainable, it's not safe, and it's not valid. But the problem that we need to solve in the developing areas is tremendous. You may have read stories like this by Runa Begum, who was born with hydrocephalus, untreated, and is not offered management because her father, 26 years old, earns £1.79 a day, and it would take him over a year and a half at least to pay for the surgery required. This procedure is performed easily in the Western world, takes about 30 minutes, and costs about £800, but it's not afforded and it's not available for children in the developed part of the world. This is one of the reasons why we should collaborate to increase the capacity. And one group of surgeons have proposed a sustainable way of increasing the surgical capacity to children and also other surgical disorders in the developing world, where instead of having hit-and-run missions, one single-focused missions where you go in and treat patients and then you return to your home country, you contribute to build a sustainable system of general care, where also teaching faculty, developing an academic culture, and producing all the steps would lead to a much greater surgical capacity that is sustainable in the region. And to do so, we might have to look at the pyramid of capacity building and research in an international collaboration in a different way. Look at the bottom line of the pyramid as capacity building as the primary initiative that can lead to registry-based data and later on to quality improvement and later on to fostering of clinical trials in those areas where this kind of capacity building is possible. From a global perspective, there is a large unmet need of patients with surgical disorders and a relative or a true shortage of surgeons there. At the same time, many regions in the world see similar disease patterns now, in particular for cancer, cardiovascular diseases, and obesity. So there is a huge potential for large trials to being developed with sufficient power if surgical capacity is present, if academic knowledge is present, and if there is support to do this kind of work. The benefits would obviously be that you will have speedier and larger trials, bigger populations to recruit from, and the results would probably be more valid and more generalizable as data will be included from several regions. You have the potential of sharing cost, personnel and facilities, and also increased success for major funding from agencies that will likely be positive towards large sufficient trials. And you have the benefit of developing networks for further collaboration if you manage to work across nations. The challenges in clinical research are roughly in some areas similar between the developed and the developing world. In the developed world, we need to have sustainable and affordable healthcare delivery as our possibilities expand. The area of personalized medicine requires more specific resources being put into what is now being dubbed as new technology or nanotechnology and the use of genomic and proteomic and metabolomic investigations. Whereas in the developing world, capacity building is clearly needed to provide for affordable and sustainable healthcare and also for research development. There are also other barriers to potential collaboration between nations, being reimbursement issues, legislation, regulation, and patient access to medical devices. Shown in this picture is the average time before governmental or approval of a medical device is given until the device is given into the patient market. And this is clearly demonstrate there is a huge difference between the European markets, the North American markets, and there is a difference also between governmental and private funding. By working together in collaboration, one could envision that the future pressure on the governments and the nations would provide for equal access to medical devices if trials are run within the same regions, across nations. And of course, there are cultural barriers. The US may view the Europeans as different from themselves and not want to collaborate with what they think is the outside world. So to sum up, many of the barriers to collaboration and recruitment in trials are either surgeon-related, it can be patient-related, it can be socio-politically related, it can also be methodology-related. And these are the things that we need to overcome for the future. Also, surgical trials are constantly being criticized for being poor, for being less than perfect organized, as this study from last year in the JACS showed that there were several flaws in the majority of interventional trials published in surgical journals. The traditional view of the evidence pyramid is the editorial expert opinion based piece being on the bottom, and the randomized controlled trials and the systematic reviews being placed on the top of the pyramid. We have to remember that this is a way of educating and pointing the opinion of the level of evidence. And there are many pyramids. There are food pyramids. There are all kinds of pyramids. I mean, we might have to think of these evidence pyramids different in the future. Some have suggested that rather than a hierarchical method, we should look at the evidence as circular instead. And particularly for surgery or surgery type of research, ways of discovering or rediscovering methodology that applies specifically to surgical problems may have to be taken into account. Being more pragmatic about the randomized controls that are being run may be one solution. Many of the randomized trials tend to be explanatory or very specific with strong or narrow inclusion and exclusion criteria, which decreases the validity of the trials. And I'm not going to go into detail in this busy slide, but it tells you the pros and the cons of selecting which trial to apply to your research question as a surgeon. And I think this is the kind of a knowledge that new surgeons need to be taught to become surgical investigators or surgical trialists. So, of course, there are examples of success from the past, both concerning randomized controlled trials and observational trials. In randomized controlled trials, you have, for example, the CRASH study published in Lancet, the Safe Surgery Saves Life study group published their observational study in the New England. There are recent consensus work published by a group of surgeons published in both Annals of Surgery and the Gut. The difference about this consensus work compared to the consensus work performed in the past is that it was a web-based work that involved over 1,000 physicians, which included a much greater opinion base than in the past when 10 or 20 expert leaders met and agreed on a consensus report. And there are now registry collaboration ongoing, for example, in Europe, a hernia surgery registry, which includes patients from 20 different countries. And there are agreements between orthopedic registries in North America, Australia, and Europe to collaborate between their own registries in orthopedics. So these are studies that have shown that it is possible to collaborate and to collaborate across types of research and types of level of evidence. Everyone agrees that the surgeon needs to be technical, adept, has to have knowledge about the disease and non-technical skills to treat the patients. And preferably, a surgeon should develop these skills within an academic framework. But we also know that what surgeons love to do is to operate. And if you ask a surgeon what he thinks, how he operates, he said, he does it perfectly, I do it my way. And all surgeons believe they are in the upper top 10 percentile of performance. Even if you should ask a health politician, tell him or her that 50% of the surgeons perform below the average performance score, they would be outraged and launch a committee to have that remedied. But we know that most of surgery is performed on an average basis without much necessarily academic background. And if you ask surgeons of a solution to a problem, you will have two different answers, which both will be correct for the same kind of problem. And the surgical bias is probably also why another reason why surgical trials tend to be doomed as poor or not correct in the aftermath after being published. So, in addition to learning the right methodology, we need to overcome the biases that are inherent with surgical research. Also, when you ask surgeons worldwide, surgeons tend to say they have no time to do research or little or no funding, and this has not improved in the current recession. There are no limited infrastructure in most hospitals or in most institutions. There's a lack of research training and a lack of mentors. And these are also barriers that need to be overcome. So one might ask, what's the benefit of doing academic surgery? Where's the beef? What's in it for me? How should you separate the sheep from the goats? Again, pointing at the structure of training, won't work. The classical way of doing clinical training is from basic to a specialist level and then to an expert level in clinical surgery. If you are involved in basic science, that tends to be blocks of training and blocks of projects that can be easily published as you go along. Whereas for the clinical trialists, the planning and execution of a trial may take decades in the worst scenario to be performed and to get the results. So it's important for the future surgeon, academic surgeon, to have that blended into the clinical profile together with the academic profile in order to succeed as an academic surgeon. So the future academic surgeons should develop clinical and technical skills as surgery becomes more specialized, but at the same time be proficient in basic or translational or clinical methodology for surgical research questions. This will probably happen at some cost of the clinical activity for the surgeon, but the surgeon can be involved in networks for collaboration because good quality research cannot happen in isolation, and preferably this should happen early in the career. So the development of networks and trial centers and research hubs is the next step in international research collaboration. The Germans have for 10 years now led a study center which has been fairly successful, has achieved trial funding and are now running several randomized controlled trials, primarily though in the German-speaking area. In the UK, surgical trial centers are now being built, led by trainees, which will train a new generation of surgeons that will understand and participate in randomized trials. In Sweden, along the national quality assurance programs, they have launched a score system, for example, for colorectal surgery, where the hospitals that include less than 10% of patients in clinical trials are penalized by being subtracted of their points. I don't know if it's the carrot or the stick that is the best solution to including more patients in trials, but it's definitely another response to the few number of patients that are currently included in surgical trials. So how can we make these initiatives that now work in isolation work together in Europe? Again, history and culture probably are barriers that prevent us from working together. Some more prominent than others, and if you look at Greece, they have maybe other reasons for not collaborating than the British or the Dutch or the Germans. But it's doable, and some organizations that are being developed now is facilitating such kind of network research. One is the European Clinical Research Infrastructure Network, which is now being launched across Europe and is an organization that tends to, or is placed there to facilitate the network between trials and trialists across Europe. Most countries are participating in one or another level currently, and the information or the support that trialists can get from there is everything from information and planning to the protocol process to conducting the trial itself. Also, some of the surgical societies are now inspiring or supporting the international trial concept with appointing specialist board members for overviewing international trials. They create trial registries within their societies, and they publish trial protocols or portfolios where members can view and recruit their own patients into the trials, such as this published by the ESCP. So I think those are good ways of increased collaboration and increase in visibility of ongoing trials that surgeons should take advantage of for the future. So what about future surgery itself? There are a number of emerging technologies going on, from stem cells to robotics to nanotechnology, that surgeons will be influenced by, if not lead the research area in itself. There is already now being published the regeneration and the experimental transplantation of bioengineered kidneys based on stem cell products, which is now possible in the lab. Of course, stem cells are pluripotent and omnipotent cells, which we just, as we know now, have no complete control over. They might develop into all kinds of cells. What we are afraid of in the humans is development of cancerous cells, of course, from normal tissue. The surgical researcher will be involved in translational research and should be directly connected to the surgical questions that needs to be addressed in this area. It's a complex field with a need for collaboration between a number of disciplines, but I think the surgeons should be in the center of the research and not only delivering the tissue to be investigated.
We need to wrap up, Kjetil.
Yep. And we might see new technology for the near future that will directly influence surgery or how we perform surgery, such as imaging of tissues in a new way. Summerskill told a bit about internet and social media. I will go quickly through this. Social media is changing the landscape that we work in. We are probably not aware of how this will directly influence surgery as a science, but it's already being there. E-medicine, e-surgery, e-health is developing rapidly. The paper journal of the past is gone. The new areas, the e-journals, with the possibility to connect between different centers, creating hubs that can gather information across the globe. We will probably see new technology that we cannot envision yet, as of yet, how it will influence surgery and surgical research and possibilities to there. We know that the patients will have a greater influence than in the past. Each decade has its own research agendas, and the current research agenda is to putting the patient in focus. The patients want to get involved, and currently there is a patient-centered outcomes research institute being launched in the USA with a number of clinical database research networks collaborating with patient-powered research networks, where the patients are actually allowed to put their opinion into the clinical work being done. So briefly to sum up, the future will be technology and biology driven, and the surgeon should be in the middle of the technology and research being done. Health service research will be instrumental both from the developed and the developing countries. Patient-oriented and patient-driven research will be the focus for the next decades. Education should be instrumental to evolve the modern surgical scientists, and we should focus on education of research methods that apply specifically to surgical questions. And this also involves development of international networks and trial hubs with increased international collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you.